I'm sitting in the penthouse at 5 in the morning. My wife never came home last night. Her phone is pinging in the middle of the city at the Four Seasons Hotel. At 8:15 a.m., she walks in, smelling of someone else's champagne and cigarettes. She opens her mouth to lie about a friend and a dead battery. But I've already packed my bag. On the kitchen island, I leave her a note with 2 lines. I know where you were. Don't bother coming to find me. I freeze her cards, transfer half of our savings into my own account, and walk out. By the time she finally realizes what's happened, I'm already sitting in a taxi on my way to the airport. Before we start, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Her side of the bed was still perfectly smooth, a cold stretch of white linen that screamed silence louder than any words ever could. Gabriel sat in the dim glow of their Seattle penthouse, watching the sun bleed across the skyline, while his phone on the marble island stayed dark. No text, no call, just the sickening confirmation of a GPS dot frozen at a downtown hotel. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just realized that the life he'd built had died the moment the clock hit 4 a.m. If you're drawn to those quiet, gut-wrenching moments where love shatters for good, stick around, because we're only scratching the surface. The silence in that apartment was thick, a physical weight pushing against Gabriel's ribs. It was 5:17 in the morning. The rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows had shifted from a steady patter into a dull, mindless drone, smearing the city lights into streaks of gray and charcoal. Gabriel perched on the edge of the California King, bare feet on the cold hardwood. To his left, the white sheets remained untouched, crisp and flat. Sophie wasn't dead. He knew that if there'd been an accident, the cops would have called by midnight. If she'd been stranded, she'd have texted. If her battery had died, she'd have found a charger. He glanced at his phone on the nightstand. Black screen, 0 notifications. No on my way, no don't worry. Just emptiness. Gabriel rose slowly, his movements stiff and robotic. He padded to the kitchen. The marble island glowed under the under-cabinet lights. He skipped the coffee. Grinding beans felt like something a man with a future would do, and Gabriel felt very much like a man whose timeline had just been cut short. He flipped open his laptop. The tracking app he and Sophie shared for safety, a running joke about kidnapping insurance, blinked on the screen. The blue dot marking her phone hadn't budged. It had been stationary since 2 a.m. at the Four Seasons downtown. He snapped the laptop shut. The click echoed through the open floor plan like a gunshot. No urge to drive over there. No urge to scream or hurl the crystal vase on the dining table. A strange, icy clarity washed over him. The feeling of a diagnosis you already knew was coming. The waiting was over. The wondering about her distant stares, her guarded texts, that was over too. He walked into the master closet. The faint trail of her perfume, sandalwood and jasmine, hung in the air, taunting him. He reached up and pulled down his leather weekender bag. He packed with cold precision. 5 shirts, 2 suits, underwear, socks, toiletries. He left behind the watch she'd given him for their anniversary. He left behind the framed photo from their honeymoon in Como. He took only what was his, what he'd had before he became Gabriel and Sophie. In 20 minutes, he'd taken apart 5 years of marriage. At the front door, he hesitated. The elevator was waiting. He'd called an Uber to take him to the airport. He didn't want the car. He wanted to disappear, but he needed to leave something behind. Not a fight. She'd love a fight. A fight would mean he still cared enough to be hurt. A fight would give her room to explain, to twist things, to cry until he gave in. So he went back to the kitchen island, pulled out a sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery, and uncapped his fountain pen, black ink. He wrote 2 sentences. No signature. He set the note in the center of the marble island, right next to her spare keys, the one thing in the room that wasn't perfectly aligned. Gabriel capped the pen, grabbed his bag, and walked out. The electronic lock beeped as it clicked shut, sealing the apartment behind him. As the elevator dropped, he checked his phone one last time. 5:58 a.m. sunrise. Up in the penthouse, the silence crept back in, coiling around that note like a loaded trap. I know where you were. Don't bother coming to find me. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime that felt obnoxiously loud inside Sophie's pounding head. It was 8:15 a.m. She stepped into the private foyer, bracing herself against the wall for a second. Morning sun blazed through the east-facing windows, harsh, interrogating light that made her wince. She reeked of flat champagne and cigarette smoke that wasn't hers. Her skin felt tight. Her makeup was probably smudged around her eyes, though she tried to fix it in the hotel lobby mirror. Sophie took a breath and slipped on her best mask, the victim of circumstance. She had her excuse ready. I had too much at the gala. Didn't want to drive. My phone died, and I couldn't find a charger. I crashed at Clara's. It was a flimsy story, full of holes. But she knew Gabriel. He'd be on the gray Italian sofa, arms folded, jaw clenched. He'd be mad. She'd cry, apologize for being careless, and eventually his hard shell would crack. He'd make her coffee, lecture her about safety, and they'd move on. That was their routine. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open. Gabriel? Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again, softer. Gabe, I'm so sorry. My phone. She stopped cold. The apartment was dead silent. Not the hush of a sleeping place, but the sterile, showroom quiet of a space with no life in it. No scent of espresso. The Nespresso machine sat cold and dark. Gabriel never started a day without coffee. Sophie stepped into the living room, her heels clicking sharp against the hardwood. The sound bounced off the walls wrong. The sofa was empty, cushions perfectly fluffed, untouched. A prickle of unease crept up her neck. He must have gone to the office early. He's giving me the silent treatment. That's fine, I can handle that. She headed down the hall to the master bedroom, desperate to wash off the Four Seasons before he got back. She pushed open the double doors. The bed was made. Gabriel never made the bed. He was tidy, sure, but he left it unmade to air out, a habit from his mom. Today the duvet was pulled tight, smooth as paper. Sophie frowned. She moved toward the walk-in closet, unzipping her dress as she went. Did the cleaner come early? She muttered. She flicked on the light, and the air left her lungs. Gabriel's side of the closet was gutted. Rows of color-coordinated suits had gaping holes where his favorites used to hang. The shelf for his folded cashmere sweaters was bare. The floor, once lined with dress shoes and loafers, showed only dusty outlines of where they'd sat. He hadn't taken everything. The winter coats, the old tuxedos, the stuff that didn't matter were still there. He'd taken the essentials, the life he actually lived. No, she whispered. The word felt like it belonged to someone else. No, no, no. She spun and ran back to the main living area, panic finally overpowering the hangover. She checked the bathroom. His toothbrush was gone. She checked the entryway, his favorite coat missing from the rack. She ran to the kitchen, hands trembling so hard she knocked a decorative bowl sideways. That's when she spotted it. The note, dead center on the island, weighed down by her own spare key set. The cream paper stood out against the dark marble. Sophie stared for a long beat, scared to touch it. Touching it made it real. Touching it meant the script she'd rehearsed in the elevator was worthless. She reached out with shaky fingers and picked it up. Gabriel's handwriting was sharp, slanted, precise. I know where you were. Don't bother coming to find me. The world tilted. Sophie gripped the counter, knuckles white. He knew. Not suspected. Knew. The lie about Clara, the dead battery, the innocent mistake. All of it crumbled in the face of that one line. She yanked her phone from her clutch, ignoring the low battery warning, and dialed his number. It didn't even ring. The subscriber you have called has been disconnected or is no longer in service. She tried again, same message. Sophie lowered the phone slowly. The silence of the apartment rushed back, louder than before. She looked around at the pristine, beautiful, expensive walls, and for the first time, she understood that without Gabriel, it wasn't a home. It was just a box, and she was the only thing left inside. She slid down the side of the cabinets until she hit the floor, the note still crumpled in her hand, while the morning sun kept shining relentlessly on the wreckage. The motel room reeked of industrial lemon cleaner and stale AC. A basic chain suite near SeaTac, the kind meant for layovers, flight crews, and people who wanted to vanish. The carpet was a dizzying brown and beige pattern, a world away from the hand-woven rugs of the penthouse. Gabriel sat at the small laminate desk. The hum of the mini-fridge was his only company as he tapped away on his laptop. He hadn't turned his phone back on. Instead, he bought a prepaid burner from a lobby kiosk, a cheap plastic thing that felt like a toy. He hadn't given that number to anyone. On his screen, their shared financial life appeared in neat, orderly rows. He told himself this wasn't revenge, it was necessity. He was an architect. When a building structure is too compromised to fix, you don't patch the cracks, you condemn it. He logged into their joint checking and transferred exactly 50% of the liquid funds into his personal account, the one he'd kept dormant since before the wedding. He didn't take a penny more than his share. He wasn't a thief. Next, he opened the credit card portal, the Amex Platinum. There it was, top of the pending list. Four Seasons, Seattle, $489, 11:42 p.m. He stared at the amount, the room charge. She hadn't just stayed out. She'd planned it enough to check in. Or maybe he had checked in. That detail was a small, sharp splinter in his gut, but he didn't flinch. He clicked Report Lost/Stolen on his primary card and froze her authorized user card. Across the city, in the glass tower overlooking the Sound, Sophie paced the living room, phone clutched like a lifeline. She'd moved past tears into a frantic, manic scramble. Pick up, you stubborn bastard, she hissed, ending her 20th call to his voicemail. Her emotions swung wildly. Guilt, then quick indignation. How dare he? How dare he just disappear without a conversation? After 5 years, that was cruel. Immature. She convinced herself he was overreacting. It was one night. A mistake, a wine-fueled lapse in judgment with a guy who actually listened to her instead of critiquing her taste in art. She opened her messaging app to fire off something sharp, something that would sting him into replying. You're being dramatic, Gabriel. We need to talk like adults. Where are? A notification slid down from the top of her screen. Not a reply, from the bank. Alert. Authorized user card ending in 8802 has been suspended by the primary account holder. Sophie stopped pacing. She stared at the screen. The air seemed to thin. Suspended, not canceled. A power play, a leash yanked tight. A second alert chimed. Wire transfer of $145,000 processed from joint checking to external account. The phone slipped from her fingers and thudded onto the plush rug. The weight of it hit her harder than the hangover, harder than the guilt. This wasn't a fight, not a temporary split where he'd crash at a buddy's place until she apologized enough. He was wiping her out. Back in the hotel room, Gabriel closed his laptop. He rubbed his eyes, fatigue finally bleeding through the adrenaline. He felt a phantom buzz in his pocket, the ghost of his old phone, the ghost of her calls. He stood and walked to the window. The view was nothing but a parking lot and the gray ribbon of the highway, ugly and perfect. He peeled off his shirt and stepped into the tiny, sterile bathroom, cranking the shower all the way to cold. He needed to go numb, to freeze out the memory of her scent before he could sleep. Because if he slept, he might dream, and in dreams, he might forgive her. And forgiveness, he knew, was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. He stepped under the icy spray and made no sound. The gallery was a white-walled cavern of polished concrete, designed to make the art pop and the patrons look pricey. It was opening night for the Urban Solitude exhibit, a title that felt like a personal jab Sophie had to wear like a badge. She stood near a massive abstract canvas, clutching a flute of champagne she hadn't touched, her smile pinned in place like a museum piece. Sophie, darling. The voice was high, sharp, dripping with fake concern. Sophie turned to find Julia, a woman whose charity work was mostly a front for gathering dirt on everyone in their zip code. Julia, Sophie said, leaning in for the air kiss. You look stunning. That dress is vintage, right? It is, Julia beamed. Then her eyes flicked over Sophie's shoulder, scanning the room, the shark circling for blood. But where's Gabriel? I don't think I've ever seen you at an opening without him. He usually loves this artist. Sophie's heart thumped against her ribs. She'd practiced this, rehearsed the line in the mirror until her voice sounded bored, casual. Oh, you know Gabriel, Sophie said, waving a hand. Emergency site visit in Vancouver, some structural issue with the new high-rise. He's devastated to miss this, but duty calls. Julia's smile held, but her eyes narrowed a fraction. Vancouver? That's odd. Mark said he saw Gabriel's car in the long-term lot at SeaTac yesterday. I thought maybe he was flying to New York. The lie lodged in Sophie's throat. The gallery air seemed to evaporate. The pretentious ambient drone music suddenly blared in her ears. Well, he flew out of SeaTac to get to Vancouver, Sophie improvised, her voice pitching higher. Last-minute flight. Of course, Julia said, holding her gaze a beat too long. It's just a shame. We were all hoping to ask him about the rumors. Rumors? Sophie said. her grip on the champagne flute tightening until she feared the stem would snap. "Oh, nothing," Julia laughed, touching Sophie's arm lightly, a touch like ice. "Just chatter. You know how people talk when they don't see the golden couple together for 48 hours. Folks say he looked intense when he left the firm on Tuesday." Sophie felt the walls close in. The vivid reds and blacks of the paintings started to blur. They knew, or they suspected. In their world, silence was admission, absence was confession. Gabriel wasn't just gone. His absence was a vacuum that sucked all the oxygen out of the room, leaving Sophie gasping. "Excuse me," she said, pulling her arm away. "I need to say hi to the curator." She didn't head for the curator. She beelined for the ladies' room, head high, ignoring the stares that landed like body blows. Inside the bathroom, she locked the stall door and pressed her forehead to the cool marble. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She pulled it out, hoping, praying it was him. Maybe he'd cooled off. Maybe he was texting that he was coming home. It was an Instagram notification. Someone had tagged her in a photo from the event. "Beautiful night at the gallery. Missing our Gabriel Thorne. Hope the trip goes well. Solo Sophie." The winking emoji was a slap. It was Julia. Sophie stared at the screen, thumbs frozen over the keyboard. She wanted to scream, to tell them all to go to hell, but she couldn't. She was trapped in the prison she'd helped build. The perfect wife, the perfect life, the perfect lie. She sank onto the closed toilet lid, her designer dress bunching around her waist. She realized then that Gabriel hadn't just left her heartbroken. He'd left her defenseless in a tank full of sharks, and he'd taken the only weapon she had, his protection. She opened her contacts, scrolled to his name again, thumb hovering over the call button. She knew it wouldn't connect. She knew he'd erased himself, but she pressed it anyway, just to hear the operator tell her that the number she loved was no longer in service. That call found a way around his defenses, through the one channel he hadn't thought to block. It came via his firm's emergency line, patched through by a terrified assistant who'd been sworn to secrecy about his whereabouts. "Mr. Thorne," the assistant's voice trembled, "it's Swedish Medical Center. They say your wife collapsed at a restaurant." They couldn't reach her phone. Gabriel didn't remember walking to the rental car. He didn't remember navigating the slick, rain-soaked streets of First Hill. His body had gone on autopilot, reverting to 5 years of programming. "Sophie's in trouble. Fix it." He sat now in the idling sedan, windshield wipers thumping back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm. The red neon sign of the ER entrance bled into the puddles on the asphalt like an open wound. It was 11 p.m. The rain kept hammering the metal roof, sealing him in a capsule of noise and isolation. She was right inside. Through those sliding glass doors, past the security desk, down a hallway that reeked of antiseptic and fear. The nurse had called it a suspected cardiac event, which Gabriel knew was code for a panic attack, so fierce her body had convinced itself it was dying. He'd seen them before. He knew how her hands would curl into claws, how her breath would snag in terrified gasps, how her eyes would roll back. 4 or 5 years, he'd been her anchor, the one with the paper bag, the one rubbing her back until the shaking stopped, the one whispering that the world wasn't ending. His hand reached for the door handle, cheap, cold plastic under his palm. "If I go in there, she wins." The thought froze him, not cruel, just clinical. If he walked through those doors, Sophie would look up with those wide, tear-drenched eyes, and the story would flip. She'd no longer be the woman who betrayed him in a hotel room. She'd be the victim, the fragile bird who needed saving. And he'd no longer be the man who stood up for his dignity. He'd be the husband who abandoned his sick wife. He'd hold her hand. She'd apologize. He'd say it's okay. And the cycle would reboot. The betrayal would get swept under the rug of her trauma, shrunk down to just another bump in their messy road. Gabriel stared at the sliding doors. He pictured her on a gurney, wired to monitors that beeped in time with a heart that was perfectly fine, just overwhelmed by the chaos she'd stirred up. She wasn't dying. She was panicking because the reality he'd forced on her was too heavy to carry alone. But that was exactly the point. She had to carry it. If he walked in and shouldered the weight for her, she'd never learn how heavy it really was. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The pull to go to her was a physical ache, a burn in his chest that felt like love but tasted like poison. He wanted to be the hero. God, he wanted to be the hero. But a hero saves someone from danger. Going in there wouldn't save her. It would only enable the version of her who believed actions don't have consequences. Not this time, he whispered to the dashboard. The sound of his own voice startled him. He shifted into reverse. The backup camera blinked on, showing the empty, rain-slicked pavement behind. He didn't glance back at the ER entrance. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror as the red neon sign shrank and shrank, until he turned the corner and it vanished into the wet Seattle night. He drove back to the hotel, the silence in the car feeling less like emptiness and more like armor. The penthouse was too quiet. Ever since she'd come back from the hospital, Sophie moved through the rooms like a ghost, haunting her own life. The doctors called it exhaustion. She knew it was the physical echo of a silence she couldn't fill. It was Thursday afternoon. The gray Seattle light filtered through the blinds of Gabriel's home office, a room she rarely entered. It had always been his sanctuary: blueprints, drafting tables, the smell of graphite and cedar. Now it was just another hollow space he'd left behind. Sophie stepped in, bare feet sinking into the vintage Persian rug. She told herself she was hunting for financial papers, something to help her untangle the mess of frozen accounts. But underneath, she knew she was searching for a reason, a secret account, a hidden message, anything that would make him the villain. She needed him to be the bad guy so she could stop feeling like the monster. She lowered herself into his leather chair. It creaked, that familiar sound that made her chest ache. His desk was immaculate, as always. A stack of Moleskine notebooks sat in the corner. She picked up the top one, not a sketchbook, but a planner. She opened it to the current month. The pages weren't filled with client meetings or site visits. They were crammed with notes in his jagged, architectural hand. October 12th, called Dr. Eris Re, Sophie's anxiety meds. Check interactions. October 14th, look into gallery lease renewal. Surprise her with the deposit. October 15th, dinner at the Pink Door. Don't talk work. Ask about her installation. Sophie's breath caught. She remembered that dinner. She remembered sitting across from him, checking her phone under the table, texting him, the hotel guy, complaining that Gabriel was boring and obsessed with logistics. Reading the note now, she saw that the logistics were just his way of loving her. Her hand shook as she moved a stack of blueprints. Underneath sat a thick manila folder labeled simply Verbo. She frowned. Verbo was that tiny Italian town they'd visited on their honeymoon. She opened it. Not a memory book, a proposal. On top was a printed email draft addressed to the senior partners of his firm. Resignation/sabbatical request. Effective November 1st, I will be stepping down from the lead architect position. As discussed, the demands of the firm have come at a personal cost I am no longer willing to pay. My wife and I need time. I intend to take the next 12 months to restore the foundation of my family. November 1st, that was next week. Sophie stared at the date on the draft. It was dated the morning of the gala. The morning of the day she decided to sleep with someone else because she felt neglected. Underneath the letter were real estate listings, a crumbling stone farmhouse in Verbo, a studio with north-facing light, perfect for an art director who wanted to paint again. He'd circled the studio in red ink and written, for Sophie. No cell service. A sob tore out of her, raw and ugly. He hadn't been pulling away. He'd been clearing the decks, quietly and methodically planning a rescue mission for their marriage, ready to walk away from the career she resented, just to give her what she'd said she wanted. While he was researching Italian farmhouses to save them, she was booking a hotel downtown to wreck them. Sophie dropped the folder. Papers fanned across the desk, a blueprint of a future that would never exist. The story she'd built to protect herself, the lonely wife, the cold husband, shattered completely. No defense left. Only the searing, unbearable clarity of what she'd done. She curled forward, pressing her forehead against the cool mahogany of his desk. And for the first time since he'd gone, she wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for the man who had loved her enough to quit the world, only to find out she wasn't worth quitting for. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled of stale coffee and pricey leather. Neutral ground, stripped of emotion, where lives got reduced to assets and liabilities. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle was doing its usual thing, weeping a fine gray mist that swallowed the horizon. Gabriel arrived first. He sat on the north side of the long mahogany table, flanked by his attorney, a woman named Eleanor with eyes like flint. He looked different, The dark circles were gone, his shoulders loose. He wore a simple charcoal sweater instead of a suit, a man who'd finally exhaled. When the door opened and Sophie walked in, the air changed. She looked thinner. Her hair, normally a cascade of perfect waves, was yanked back in a severe low bun. She ignored the view, her eyes locked straight onto Gabriel. For 3 months, they'd communicated only via PDF attachments and server pings. Seeing him in person hit her like a physical blow. She hesitated at the chair across from him, her hand gripping the back a beat too long before she sat. "Gabriel," she said, her voice brittle. "Sophie," he nodded, polite, distant. The tone you use for a stranger who accidentally bumped into you on the sidewalk. The mediation kicked off. The lawyers did the talking: penthouse equity, art collection, retirement accounts, a dry, rhythmic inventory of a life being taken apart. Gabriel agreed to almost everything. He didn't fight for the Chagall print she adored. He didn't contest the furniture's valuation. He just wanted it over. Regarding the property in Verbo, Eleanor said, glancing at a file, "My client has already retracted the offer on the farmhouse, so that asset is null." Sophie winced. The word Verbo hung in the air like smoke. "Can we have a moment?" she asked suddenly. Her lawyer shot her a weary look. I need a moment with him, please." Eleanor glanced at Gabriel. He stared at the wood grain for a long, heavy silence, then gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. The lawyers stood, collected their files, and left. The heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing them in. The silence that followed was louder than the rain outside. "I saw the file," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "I went into your office. I saw the sabbatical letter. I saw the farmhouse." Gabriel didn't look up. He traced the edge of a coaster with his thumb. "It doesn't matter now. It matters to me," she insisted, leaning in. "You were trying to save us, and I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Gabriel said. He finally lifted his eyes, and they were clear, free of the anger she'd braced for. "That was worse. You felt lonely, Sophie, I get that. I was working too much. But you didn't come to me. You didn't yell. You didn't fight. You just stepped out." "I didn't just step out," Sophie whispered. This was it, the truth she'd been carrying like a stone. It wasn't just about attention, Gabriel. It wasn't just sex. Gabriel went still. He waited. "I knew you were good," she said, tears finally spilling. "I knew you were solid and perfect and trying, and it terrified me. I felt like I was suffocating under how good you were. I wanted to break it. I wanted to burn it all down because I didn't think I deserved to live in it anymore." She drew a shaky breath. The confession ripped her throat. "That night at the hotel, I wasn't just with him. I was waiting for you to call. I wanted you to catch me. I wanted to force a crisis because I didn't know how to ask for a change." Gabriel looked at her, letting it sink in. The woman he'd loved had wrecked their marriage not out of simple lust, but out of a twisted urge for self-destruction. She'd torched the house just to see if he'd carry her out of the flames. "You wanted a crisis," he said softly. "You got a conclusion." "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I am so sorry." "I know," Gabriel said. He stood, didn't reach for her hand, didn't offer a tissue. "But the problem with burning things down, Sophie, is you can't live in the ashes." "I can't live in the ashes." He walked to the door and opened it. The lawyers looked up from their phones in the hallway. "We're ready to sign," Gabriel said. Sophie sat alone at the table, her confession still hanging in the air, realizing that the truth hadn't set her free. It had only confirmed that she was the one who'd struck the match. The end of a marriage doesn't come with a scream or a crash. It comes with the scratch of a ballpoint pen on heavy bond paper, followed by the dull, rhythmic thud of a notary stamp. Thud, thud, thud. 3 copies. One for him, one for her, one for the state. Gabriel capped his pen and set it down. He didn't glance at Sophie. He stared at his own signature, his name looking odd and alone without hers beside it. Done. The legal entity of Gabriel and Sophie had been dissolved, liquidated, filed away. "That concludes the signing," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but professional. "The decree will be final in 30 days. Gabriel rose. He adjusted his coat, a small move that carried a ton of finality. He turned to Sophie. She was still seated, eyes fixed on the wet ink, her hands clasped tight in her lap to stop the shaking. "Take care of yourself, Sophie." Not an insult, not a blessing, just a fact. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, strides steady and long, never looking back at the glass walls, never pausing at the elevator to question his choice. When he stepped out onto 2nd Avenue, the rain had stopped. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and exhaust. Gabriel filled his lungs with the sharp city air. For the first time in months, the crushing weight on his chest was gone. He walked to his car, unlocked it, and slid in. He didn't know exactly where he was heading. Maybe the airport, maybe Italy, maybe just a coffee shop where no one knew his name. It didn't matter. Forward was the only direction. An hour later, Sophie stood in the foyer of the penthouse. She'd fought hard for this place. In the settlement, she'd insisted on keeping it. It was the crown jewel of their assets, the physical trophy of their success. She'd won. She punched in the code. The lock chirped, a cheerful electronic blip that echoed in the hollowness. She stepped inside. Late afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, throwing long golden shadows across the living room. Dust motes floated in the light. The furniture sat exactly where it always had. The art still hung on the walls. The kitchen island where he'd left that first note gleamed empty. It was perfect, beautiful, and completely lifeless. Sophie drifted through the rooms, heels clicking on the hardwood. She trailed her fingers over the back of the gray sofa, ran them along the book spines on the shelf. Everything preserved, frozen in amber. She realized then what she'd actually fought for, not a home, but a museum. She was the curator of an exhibit called The Life We Used to Have. She walked into the master bedroom. The bed was made exactly as he'd left it that morning 3 months ago. The closet door hung open, revealing the bare space where his clothes once lived. The silence was absolute. No hum of the Nespresso, no rustle of him turning pages in the next room, no warmth. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed. She looked out at the city skyline, the view they'd conquered together, the buildings he'd helped design. She had the view. She had the status. She had the freedom she thought she'd wanted. She lay back on the cold, perfect duvet and closed her eyes, listening to the deafening sound of having everything and holding nothing.